So today we have Erik Huddleston, and I can't remember last time we talked to you. Did you were you still at iFast or were you in your new role?
I was still at iFast. I think you guys were the first ones that I told that I had an offer someplace else. Because I think you guys were legitimately like the first call that I had told anybody else.
Tell us what you're doing then.
Yeah, so I'm now a sports performance coach with the Indiana Pacers in the NBA, then also their G League affiliate, the Fort Wayne Mad Ants. So we're in All-Star break right now, so we're a little over halfway through the season. My first day off in probably 2 or 3 months, so
that's why you get the big bucks.
Yeah,
that's why you get the big bucks, buddy.
Right.
So you're the head strength coach. Is that how you would say it for the G League, right?
Yep. So I'm in charge of all of their programming and kind of their rehabilitation training and all that stuff. Okay,
and then tell us what you do for the Pacers real quick.
So they have some lower level guys, or I struggle to say lower level. They have some developmental guys that I'll work with. We obviously have two-way players that have an NBA contract and a G League contract, and they switch back and forth between those two teams. So kind of whatever they need for me to do. If guys stay home and need to be trained, while the team's on the road or anything like that, I had the opportunity to do some of that stuff. And then, I'll be a part of I guess we're already looking forward to the off season this year. So I'll have some pre-draft stuff that we'll do with the team, and then obviously summer league and stuff like that to be a part of. So
will you be involved in the pre-draft things, looking at the players and evaluating them and things?
Yeah, so we do, and we'll go through all that stuff. Like obviously I've never been through that because I was hired, after that, basically right before the season started this year. So I'll have the opportunity to kind of go through what their draft process is like, what their player evaluation process is like from a training standpoint, from a data standpoint, and then get to be kind of part of that onboarding process when we start summer league and have a lot of the young guys, play a bigger role at least during the summer league.
How deep are they into sports science and that kind of stuff?
Pretty deep. I mean, we have all the resources that you could ask for. Obviously I think the thing that gets used the most is probably the force plates because you can make a lot of parallels with it. But yeah, we have, there's no lack of resource available for sure. And we have a full-time data scientist too. So they hired somebody, she's fantastic. Her name's Sarah Kessler. She's she did her PhD at Harvard. So yeah, very, very smart and really, really eager and hungry to have some progress made in that department for this organization. So it's I've learned a lot from her. And part of my goal moving forward, at least from a personal development route, is to kind of be able to bridge the gap between understanding movement and athletic movement and kind of in the data side of things and being able to speak to both sides, but also be able to, correlate changes on both sides of that and how training should be geared towards decision-making, I guess.
So have you seen, I don't know if you got a chance to work with them enough, but have you seen changes in the players that you work with then?
Yeah.
Because of the sports science and things?
Yeah. And it is, so there's so many variables around that too. So I want to be careful with how I say this, but the timing of testing is a huge thing, right? So like when we test becomes very inconsistent at this point in the season because no two like if I wanted to do force plate testing every Thursday, no 2 Thursdays at this point in the season are alike, right?
Sure.
So it's like, how many days have they had between testing? How many times a week do we as an organization want to prioritize testing? when are we scheduling this testing? So is it happening after a back-to-back? Is it happening after we get back from a road trip? Is it happening when we're here, in Indianapolis for 3 days, which isn't happening that often at this point anymore. So how we do that and then how we correlate that with a positive or negative, outcome on the player's end in terms of the data that we're looking at, like I'm still learning how to make sense of that, because how much of it could be attributed to bad sleep, and how much of a decrease in performance could be attributed to bad sleep when we just got back from a six-day road trip.
Right.
How much of a percentage am I willing to say that's circumstantial based on the variables that surround basketball? And then at the end of the day, am I ever going to change the incredible variability that this sport has? And probably not.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
As long as the trends over time are in a positive, geared towards a positive direction, I think that I take more, I'm able to say, okay, yes, we're doing things well. But it's hard to say sometimes, because there are, I'll be honest, there are weeks now where we don't have time for testing. So it's not something that I implement.
Right.
So it just depends.
Interesting.
Are you making training decisions based on the testing as of now? Or are you still kind of working through how those two could be related?
That's a good question. The easy answer is no. The easy answer is that I'm not making training decisions based on the results that I'm getting in testing. I think that it's important. So obviously, like the easiest way to use the data points that we get is in hindsight as a reconditioning tool, right? Or as a return to play protocol. So a guy gets hurt, and then you've got standards that you've accumulated so much data that there are standards for where we should be at to be at a playing level. That's the easy way. I've been fortunate that not a lot of our guys have been hurt. So then how do I use it in a way that makes sense from a training standpoint? And that's kind of where I've been trying to take markers in terms of the phases of a counter movement jump and be able to apply those to general like movement qualities and see how those two things match up. So if I give an example of it, it's like, if I understand that the braking phase of a counter movement jump requires a lot of concentric muscle activity, which is going to be an internal rotation bias, and I've got an athlete that I know is limited in internal rotation, that number is automatically that the percentage of their eccentric portion of their counter movement jump is going to be limited in the braking phase, because, or it's going to be, it might not be limited as a percentage. It's going to be limited in terms of the amount of force that they put into the ground and during that braking phase. So the braking phase is usually going to be longer. It's going to be a lower force output. And then I understand that if I were to lie that person down on the table, their hip internal rotation is going to be limited because it's something that they're usually already stuck in. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can we dive into this a little bit deeper? Because it kind of relates to what we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I'll pull up, because I took a screenshot of those Instagram posts.
Okay.
I'll pull those up. If someone's listening, not on like YouTube or something, they may not have access to the screen, just so you're aware.
That's cool.
But if you want to just kind of break down this diagram here, and then we can kind of go into some of the like portions of it and what you're thinking in terms of like your training strategies and stuff like that.
All right. Yeah. So I'm going to preface this first with the fact that this is like any visual model, this is going to be really imperfect in a lot of ways. And really this came about, this is on a whiteboard, like in our weight room, but this came about on a discussion that I was having with our sports performance intern, Scott, and kind of like the visual representation of these fields of ER and IR, and then how cyclical force acceptance and force production are going to be in this kind of athletic movement continuum. So the imperfect part about this is, and I'm sure that you can pick up on more than one, but these blue markers are important moments in kind of the force production cycle and important phase starts and ends for each of those. And if you start on the left, so for anybody listening, this is like whatever the infinity symbol is called, ellipsis. Is that the infinity symbol? I can't remember. No, so. Ellipsis is like that period colon thing. Oh gosh.
Looks like a figure eight to me.
That's fine. Rufus will cut this out. Yeah, it's a figure 8 on its side.
No, we're leaving this in. It's a figure 8 on its side.
There we go. So to initiate the movement, and this is going to be, I drew this in reference to gait, but I'm going to talk about it in reference to a counter movement jump because that's the example that I've already started on. So you're going to start with a counter movement jump by free falling. That is essentially the first 30 degrees of hip flexion that you'll get in a counter movement is going to be free fall. That is max ER. So to be able to allow gravity to do its job and to actually fall in a position with any type of vertical displacement of your pelvis is going to be max ER. So it's total unweighting, it's pelvic diaphragm that's eccentrically oriented, it's guts that are pushing you down. It is in general relaxed muscles and yielding connective tissue. So it's a relaxed muscle is eccentrically oriented by nature. Eccentric orientation is not a contraction. So it doesn't require any input. It doesn't require any output on that end. So you have the start of the unweighting phase. You go around, you follow the arrows. We begin the braking phase. So that's where we transition to red in this graphic, because red is going to be like our IR, so internal rotation, compression, force production bias, and that's what we start to transition to as soon as you have the braking phase. So like I said earlier, the braking phase, you're still going down in the counter movement jump, but it requires concentric muscle activity to actually stop you at the bottom of the jump. So in theory, these two things have to cancel each other out. The unweighting phase and the braking phase have to cancel each other out in terms of the net impulse that they create, and that equals 0 at the bottom. So that's where we get this amortization phase that is no momentum, but max force production, because now if you actually read the force time chart that comes out with the counter movement jump, it's interesting because you're at the bottom of the jump, but you have the highest peak in force production at that point. So that's that amortization phase. Max propulsion,
just to clarify, that's the initial push off then?
That's you at the bottom transitioning from
down to stop to up, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That amortization phase is that stop. It happens this quick when you're looking at if we're talking about a jump here. It happens that fast.
Right.
It's where you get a number on the readout from a data standpoint is force at 0 velocity. So that's the culmination of unweighting and braking phase at the bottom. And people generally lump that in as one thing. And so you have amortization, you have the most IR that they're going to go through in this particular movement. And then you have the reorientation as they start to leave the ground, heel comes off, and you have what's called the propulsive phase when they're actually, it's a positive force relationship. So all of this up into the point of the amortization phase is the negative force relationship because they're descending. And then you have a positive force relationship that goes up out of that. And so then you have it loop around. Now this is where, in this example for a counter movement jump and gait, these blue markers have to start moving at this point, because if it's gait, you have reciprocal movement happening on the other side. So the bias of the pelvis can't be the same all the way around this for both sides, because one foot's pushing off and one foot's in the air, right? Like gait only has single leg contact when you're talking about anything faster than a walk. So the bias can't be unilateral in terms of what the pelvis is experiencing. So these start to change. And the same thing, if this is going to be any type of athletic movement that's other than a single counter movement jump, this visual can't work. So those blue markers have to start moving, because as soon as we get past the propulsive phase and we're leaving the ground, if this were gait, I'm leaving the ground, the other foot's hitting the ground. And so this would immediately lead into that leaving the ground becomes free falling on the other leg as you are reorienting into early propulsion and then going back around towards middle propulsion on the other leg. So gait has a really clear, like, overarching bias at the pelvis because there's only one leg on the ground at a time. And so the bias of the pelvis is a resultant of the foot that's on the ground. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. So
ask a question, Corey.
So
yeah, can we go Can we go back to the free falling and the unweighting versus the braking phase?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the net impulse has to be 0.
By the time you hit the amortization phase, or you haven't stopped at the bottom of the jump.
Meaning that so essentially what's happening is, to stop yourself, the eccentric muscle activity switches to concentric, and those two like forces have to cancel each other out.
Yes.
And depending on the person who's performing the jump, those two phases will look different based on what they're capable of in terms of creating internal and external rotation.
Yes. So like, keep in mind, and the point that this is all directing to is the fact that, so let's assume everything in green on this chart is ER, everything in red is IR, because that's how I designed it on there. If I am so limited in one of those two things, I'm going to compensate. And so the field that I'm in, ER or IR, becomes exaggerated, or I'm using it more than I should be using it. And that's where we run into this whole dilemma back and forth about, I mean, this is an industry-wide argument about compensation is good. Compensation inherently helps me achieve a task, right? So like, if it's this, it's jumping off the ground. So you don't want to necessarily eliminate compensation. You're supposed to mitigate it to the point that it doesn't cause any type of negative adverse effects, right? So like pain, or, hopefully not injury. But at the same time, I can make an argument based on this, that allowing more, creating a more movement efficient athlete would reduce compensation and increase athletic performance. Because if I'm able to increase, remember, these two things rely on each other to cancel each other out. So if what I've been taught is that if I increase the magnitude of the braking phase, my jump height goes up, which is what the literature says. Like, if you that's where we get all this eccentric rate of force development training talk, is that if you increase the magnitude of your braking phase, or the potential of your braking phase, your jump goes up. You're able to produce more force. I can increase the potential of that, the magnitude of my braking phase, by increasing the impulse of my unweighting phase then, because those two things have to cancel each other.
Can you dive into that a little bit more? I think that's a really interesting point that people may have trouble connecting the dots with.
Right. So force production is really for people like in our model network, I guess, whatever you want to call Bill's model. IR and compression is the method for which force production, it's the pathway for force production. It's how force production happens. And so when I've got athletes that are already generally, based on their structural bias, in an internally rotated position, so when they measure them on the table, they show a lack of internal rotation. If I'm able to give them a greater field of external rotation, I now have a greater chance of achieving a higher impulse unweighting phase, which then, because the braking phase has to cancel that larger unweighting phase out for me to stop myself at the bottom, I've now increased the magnitude and the potential of that braking phase. So by making the green part bigger, I can maximize the potential of the red part, which I already inherently have as an athlete. And I'm speaking obviously not about myself, but like, athletes already possess force production qualities, especially the ones that I work with that are like at the highest level of what they do, right? Like they're internal rotation, force production, compression monsters, and they've learned how to do that over the course of their athletic life. And so what they don't have is the ability to dial that back and to create space in certain places, and to eccentrically orient a lot of musculature, and to allow, their pelvic diaphragm to descend. And a lot of that is structural, right? Like if they've got a narrow or a small pelvis relative to their shoulder width, that creates this gradient that wants to push them towards the ground. There's not a lot I can do about the genetic shape that some of these guys have, but I can increase, at least to their full potential, the ability for them to de-weight and fall into this position. And so if I make that, if I increase their availability for ER, I'm going to potentially maximize their ability to IR, because now they have a more complete excursion between those two things. And they've already got the superpower, that's the red part. They need kind of the suppleness that's provided by the green portion.
I think that's a really interesting point. So, because it's kind of like if you give someone access to more joint excursion, their tissues can yield, certain muscles can eccentrically orient. You're saying they're gonna naturally be able to counteract that during the braking phase because they already have those qualities.
They already have it. Yeah, they're already good at that.
So how does that compare to the people you may be seeing at IFAST who are younger athletes in terms of addressing something like this? I know you don't have access to force plates, but just kind of like generally speaking.
It's easy enough at this point to make that comparison, though, because generally what I'm dealing with, or what I was dealing with at IFAST, if we're looking at their strong suit, it's not overcoming gravity well. So they already had the green portion. Like, they already had the ability to unweight, eccentrically orient, to let gravity like push them into the ground, because that was like, I trained, and I don't want to put a stereotype of who low force producers are, but like, I had a lot of female volleyball players who from a shape standpoint, it's not ideal, because they have a narrower shoulder, a wider waist. That makes things easy to go down, and there's a velocity that pushes them to the ground. And it makes it very difficult for them to turn things back around on the way up. So knee valgus is a compensation that's provided when you have no force production qualities besides steep internal rotation at the femur to get pressure to go back up. So they really excelled in the green portions of this. Like, if you put enough weight on them, they're going to fall on their butt. What they needed was the red portion. The red portion is what is traditional strength and conditioning training. Like, that is learning how to that's increasing superficial musculature to add compression. That's being able to have a longer, slower rate of force development, because that creates at least a basement for them to work off of. Like, it depends on the age of the athlete, but working at IFAST, it's like, let's just build the basement, and then we can start working on like the velocity that they're able to create compression at, because that's where sport lies. Obviously, like, unless they're a power lifter, there's a time component to what they're doing from a sport standpoint. So like, they need to have that rate of force production be increasing as we go. But if I've got an 11-year-old or 13-year-old that comes in, like, general strength training will increase their potential at that red portion, because now you're teaching them to have internal rotation. You're teaching them to pressurize their thorax and their pelvis. You're teaching them to, you might be adding a little bit of muscle mass. And that's probably mostly them just maturing, but you have things that you're adding on top of that create, a robustness in that red area, because they already have the green loop. And on the flip side of that, like I said, are athletes that really have a robust, force production, internal rotation bias. And so I can increase the effectiveness of that small portion by adding all of these, quote unquote, movement quality of variables.
So, anything you want to add, Rufus?
Well, I'm just going to ask, so the braking phase on everybody is different, correct?
What do you mean?
Well, so if you were to time it on a force plate.
Yeah.
So the braking phase is different, or
Generally,
is different on everybody. And what you want to do is to speed up that braking phase, correct? And then to reverse it so that you can get through the amortization phase.
So that's where impulse comes into play, because impulse is a force and time component. So when you look at this on like the actual, like an actual force deck readout, the impulse for unweighting can be rather long and shallow, so it's not much force that's going into the ground, but it is, because it's essentially body weight, but it takes a much longer portion of that eccentric portion of the counter movement jump. Does that make sense? It's like,
Yep.
it might take, if the eccentric portion is this long, the unweighting phase might be this long, and so you have this small bit left that's going to be that braking phase. So yeah, what you said is correct. It should happen as quickly and as forcefully as possible, because the impulses cancel each other out. That doesn't mean that they have the same peak force or the same duration. The impulse, the actual area that it takes up in terms of force and velocity, is the same. So I think that's where people get confused about impulse, because impulse in general is not like the most digestible metric that we can look at, but it makes sense once you look at like the field that it covers.
Right.
So you're trying to have that braking phase be as quick, and also like the unweighting phase, like Corey said, is where we have yielding connective tissue. So the connective tissue is lengthening and storing energy. And once it releases during the braking phase, and especially during the amortization phase, like that's where all of this stretch shortening stuff is coming together, and you're being as forceful into the ground as possible.
And so is that pretty easy to develop at your level?
It depends on where you want to focus your time and efforts at. Then it depends on what, like, for me, I don't think it's that challenging of a concept to grasp or a concept to change. You have to be incredibly consistent, because the time structure and the travel schedule, and frankly, like athletes' attention span, all of those things are very, very short. And so it's kind of based on the coach that you're looking at, and where they want to put their eggs, like which basket they want to put their eggs in. Because I believe in this, like I've seen change happen in this kind of thing. And I think that from a movement standpoint, from a injury, I'm not going to say injury prevention, but from a injury mitigation and force acceptance standpoint, it makes sense to me. And then from how this benefits the actual, like we always talk about the health and performance spectrum, like you're going to one side or the other. This to me encapsulates both sides. It gives me the ability to maximize the force production moment that I want to maximize. And it also gives me this ER biased, expansion biased force acceptance ability that most of my athletes didn't have before. So I'm covering the end of, like, I always hear the analogy of like, yeah, like we're increasing force production, we're increasing their vertical jump height, but we're not increasing their ability to land from that height. And I think that this does both ends of that.
So how do you, and in my terms, how do you train that?
Yeah, so it depends. And that's
is that where the eccentric comes in?
So yes and no.
Well, before you get into this, I'll just click up your other slide.
Okay. Yeah, for anybody that wants to bore themselves, they can read that whole thing.
So hang on just one second. If you're listening to this on Spotify and you want to go back and see these, it's EPH 24.
Yeah, EPH.24.
.24 at
yep.
on that whatever that Insta thing.
On the Instagram. Yep.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you're good. Thank you for that plug. That's much appreciated. So traditional eccentric training, unfortunately, only trains the braking phase, because it requires a ton of concentric muscle activity in order to stop the load from going down.
Okay.
So it's not free falling, right? Like if you're free falling, that's a free fall. You clearly know when you're falling. And then when you're, yes, versus trying to eccentrically load tissues, which is a weird concept to me to begin with, because the muscle is lengthening. So it's not technically loading it. You're just getting a stretch, and it's probably more connective tissue stretch than it is like muscle length change, if I had to guess. So when you look at stuff like K boxes, so this was a really interesting discussion that I've had a couple of times with different people, but K boxes are like the flywheel training, like, you know what I'm talking about, like the wheels that stuff.
Jim Ferriss likes that.
Yeah. Yes. So that stuff is interesting to me in theory, and in practice doesn't work quite the same way that I think they think it works. So if it's pulling me into the ground immediately, what's your gut, what's your initial reaction to that? Do you let it pull you in, or do you start to pull up against it immediately?
Resist it, pull up against it. Yeah,
exactly. So how is that? It's not training the unweighting portion. So if you have somebody who is limited in the braking phase, like you've done all the measurements that you need to do, and you've noticed that their braking phase just isn't as forceful as it should be, and they have access to the unweighting phase, then do it, right? Like, it's pulling them into the ground. They immediately have to resist it. Unfortunately, they're going to have to resist it through that 30-degree range where they're supposed to be unweighting. But if they already have a pretty good unweighting phase, you're probably not going to take much away from that. So yeah, if you're a high school volleyball player, not every high school volleyball player, obviously, but if you are someone that struggles with force production, the K box is useful, in my opinion.
So that would be if you're struggling with the braking phase, you can't overcome the forces in that period of time from the unweighting phase.
Say that again.
If you're struggling with the braking phase, you're having trouble overcoming the forces from the unweighting phase.
Yes, exactly. So you are too susceptible to the pull of gravity. And so once it starts acting on you, you have a hard time turning that around and pushing back up. So it is useful, absolutely, in helping people turn that braking phase around into a propulsive phase. That's generally not the people that I work with. So what becomes really muddy is that this concept of eccentric training is now being applied to people who are able to create force eccentrically. They're doing that from the moment their knees break and their hips start going back.
Which is your guys, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And so what they need is the unweighting phase, and what we've given them is heavy RDLs and flywheel training that immediately pulls them into the ground, immediately. Okay. And they are resisting that. So what I'm doing now is I'm giving the braking phase that they are already generally pretty competent in, and I'm increasing the magnitude of that braking phase without accounting for the unweighting phase at all. Because all the research is geared towards the braking phase. They understand the concept of and you know, they do training for these studies with you know, untrained male soccer players or whatever it is. So it's like, yeah, they're going to see a benefit in force production and jump height when you've got somebody untrained who's now learning to recruit concentric musculature during the eccentric portion of a jump, because all they needed was traditional strength training anyways.
Okay.
That's not my guy.
Right.
I don't work with anybody who doesn't already know how to create force and leave the ground. Right. So what becomes necessary is, and what I've found success for, at least recently, is, do they know how to fall? Like, first of all, at like a Neanderthal level, I've got athletes that are afraid of getting on the ground. They're tall. Falling for them generally hurts because they hit a hardwood surface. They don't generally have access to movement qualities that I think are pertinent towards relaxed falling, right? Like, if they're concentrically oriented from the start, they land pretty stiff on the ground. And so they're not comfortable in free fall. So stuff like, you know, anterior to posterior rolling on the ground, where they get used to having their back articulate with the floor and get used to like being seated on a hardwood surface, is useful. Controlled falling. So, you know, I have them, and I have some stuff on Instagram with this too, but like learning how to do squat drops where they just free fall, you know, in a squat position to the floor and then fall on a gymnastics mat, or even built up, you know, to where they're sitting down to a box at that squat height, and they rock back on the box and rock back forward. And so learning for them to unweight safely has had benefit. At the same time, like some of the oscillatory isometric stuff, so where they drop and catch a kettlebell, like that's useful to me because they have to drop faster than the kettlebell in order to get below it and then get their hands back on it. So there is usefulness in that. And then it doesn't have to be trained in isolation either, right? Like I don't have to, when I'm working with somebody on the unweighting phase, I don't have to neglect the braking phase or the propulsive phase with that. I just have to make sure that I'm doing enough of the unweighting so that it doesn't get put on the back burner again, like it has been for years with these guys anyways.
So what I do like a controlled eccentric movement, say a 4 count, and then go up fast. Will that be kind of training what we're talking about?
That would be mostly braking. And it depends on the load.
Right.
So think about it in terms of rate of loading. So this was really useful, and Bill's talked about this. So let's say I've set up an RDL on a barbell in the rack.
Okay.
As soon as I take that barbell out of the rack, so let's say there's 200 pounds on it. How much of that weight is on me?
Good question. Not a whole lot.
All of it. As soon as I take it out of the rack, I am
RDL. Oh, yeah, okay. I see what you're saying.
I'm instantly holding 200 pounds, and it's 200 pounds from the top to the bottom. So what has happened from a connective tissue standpoint is I have immediately created an overcoming rigid connective tissue that doesn't want to change length, because the weight in my hands is instantaneous load. It is it's the same thing as if I'm going to pull a heavy back squat out of the rack. It is heavy from the start, and that's why it's you see powerlifters have to have a certain amount of weight on their back to get down in the squat, even because they're allowing that weight to push them to the bottom, because otherwise they're not compressible human beings. Like they're very rigid and incompressible at certain ranges. So the same thing happens with a heavy deadlift. If I pull it out of the rack, my sacrum nutates. I get in a more propulsive, middle propulsive to late propulsive position. And I go through a range of motion with essentially no connective tissue length change. I get muscular length change with compression kind of layered into it because of the fact that there's weight on the bar.
Okay.
So what I'm talking about is more effective in my population is having them drop and catch a weight is, even though it's a quick movement, it is a slower rate of loading. So if I drop and catch a kettlebell from goblet position, so I have to squat under it to catch the kettlebell again, as soon as it touches my hands, it starts to weigh a little bit more. And then as I get more weight under it, it starts to weigh a little bit more. And even though the movement happens like that, the kettlebell doesn't weigh 20 kilos the entire time that I'm catching it until I actually put a stop to the kettlebell. That's a slower rate of loading, because now the connective tissue has said, okay, there's a little bit of weight added. There's a little bit of weight. Now there's 20 kilos added, and my connective tissue is going to stop making a length change.
It's funny because I use that with a lot of people who struggle with just strength training without pain, because when you put load in their hand, regardless of how heavy it is, their initial reaction is to like ramp up muscle activity like 100%.
It's to compress. Yeah. Anytime. Yeah. And especially I see this again with this population, because they're not fans of heavy weight. It's generally not been their friend, and they have a lower relative training age to some athletes. Like, I'm not going to say that they have a low training age, because basketball is training itself, but like they're not comfortable in the weight room a lot of the times. And so as soon as they see a barbell loaded up in a rack, from a breathing standpoint, breath starts to shorten. Like they start to exhale. Like, Rufus, like when you put a heavy barbell on somebody's back, like what's their breathing strategy when they get that bar out of the rack?
All of a sudden they're taking these deep breaths,
Yeah.
and they're pretty quick. It may not be deep, but the breathing is quick.
The respiration becomes quick. And then that's why Valsalva maneuver is so useful, because it creates structure in their thorax that is less variable. So when you're under a heavy load, the last thing you want is all of this loose mobility training stuff, right? Like you don't want to be, I use I use the example of Gumby all the time, and kids don't know who Gumby is anymore.
I've been using that for 40 years.
It's like a reference nobody gets. But like, you don't want Gumby under a heavy barbell, because Gumby isn't able to create enough rigid structure to resist the weight from pushing them into the ground.
Yeah.
Eric,
So I'm trying to create an athlete that is more susceptible to gravity's pull, and then also able to use, the genetic force output gifts that they've accumulated over the years.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Eric,
Corey.
In terms of this, like training this unweighting phase, do you think there's a component of the fact that these athletes are so tall and they're so far away from the ground, so to speak, anytime they like do some type of descent, whether it's a hinge or a squat, they're going to be more likely to just use more concentric muscle activity to get there and decrease chance of falling?
They're worried of falling all the time. Like, falling is not their friend in sport. And so that's where I've had to get them like the high box falling stuff. So I'll put a box that's like, 2/3 of their squat depth up. And that generally puts me around 30 degrees of hip flexion. So like, if all it is them falling to a seated position on a box, they're generally okay with that. I have some guys that really do enjoy, like as part of their warm up, I might do some of those squat drop things where they reach their arms out or a plate out in front of them, and they sit they will let themselves fall all the way to their heels in a squat, and then roll back on their back and try to roll back up to their feet. And like, it's like a very gymnastics, floor-based looking stuff. But some of them enjoy that. And then others are, you have to kind of spoon feed them the unweighting phase stuff to get them comfortable with it. So it's just how useful are the constraints that you're putting in terms of the exercise setup. Like, if I know that someone is uncomfortable with the falling sensation, I have them fall less or to a lesser height than I would some of the other guys who I think really benefit from a full fall all the way to the ground type of movement to get them comfortable in something like that, because the velocity tends to pick up as they fall. And then like looping back in this kind of a side tangent on that, like if they don't have 30 degrees of hip flexion available, which that happens, that's my first kind of plan of attack, or like the hierarchy of things that I need to address, because I can do all the unweighting training, and if they don't even have access to the minimum required movement availability to gain benefit from the movement that I'm looking for, then like there's no point in doing it. So that's where undoing some of these compensations, or at least like having them have a more open movement option window, becomes more beneficial, because if they don't have the 30 degrees of hip flexion to begin with, there's no point in me training any of this, because it's not going to get any better.
So is 30 degrees about the height you want them to stop at when they do a vertical jump?
No, so they're going to go past that in a vertical jump because of the braking phase that happens. But the braking phase is fewer degrees of hip flexion overall than the unweighting phase is. I would say, if they pass through 30 and they're unweighting and they hit 45, 50 by the time that they're at their amortization phase, I'm okay with that. But I'm not looking to I'm also not looking to standardize that, because then we can get in a whole kind of other side tangent about limb length and how compressible is their torso, and you can kind of go in this rabbit hole of trying to standardize something like that when it becomes more variable because of the minor discrepancies in kind of the athletes that you're looking at.
So they all should train like professional wrestlers and to learn how to take a bump, and gymnasts so they know where they are in space. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, that's a little more black and white, but yeah.
That's awesome.
Anytime you use they all in a sentence, it becomes difficult at this level.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, as kids.
Oh, as kids, yeah. I mean, I think that.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that, you know, they should learn how to fall.
Yeah.
And take gymnastics just for the body awareness in space and things like that.
You can have a great like you can have a really, really well-rounded training program by implementing some of this stuff as a warm-up, or you know, superset with your traditional strength conditioning stuff, and it generally has a good outcome.
Yeah.
Sweet. Can we go back to that infinity symbol looking chart you drew?
Do whatever you want.
And can we talk about it more in the context of a cut?
Sure.
Because the counter movement jumps very like you're gonna hit that landing phase, then it's done, right?
Right.
Versus like a cut, once you hit that landing phase on one of the limbs, something else has to happen.
Right.
To continue to get in and out of the cut.
Right.
So can you go into how that's going to kind of change this thought process here, and how it might be different versus something like a counter movement jump?
Yeah, let's work through this, because I this is a good experiment, because I haven't thought about this in relation to a cut much either. And so let's start with like.
Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. So as I'm free falling, let's say I'm going into a right foot cut. So I'm going to be planting off of my right leg and pushing off my right side, okay? The last step that I've taken off my left leg is going to lead to what is eventually going to be the cut off my right foot, right? So as that right foot is approaching the ground, and you know, there's some, I guess, query about like what kind of movement you're going into a cut with, like am I running into a cut or am I shuffling into a cut or whatever. So we'll figure that out as we go. If I'm
this is good. This is good. This is really good. Go ahead.
That foot is, let's say I'm shuffling. I've pushed off my left foot. Theoretically in a shuffle, because you have similarities with gait, like neither foot is on the ground once I've shoved off of my left foot and I'm going to land on my right foot. That is a free fall. The first foot that's going to hit, because of my momentum to the right, because I've pushed off my left, is going to be my right foot. So my right foot goes through an unweighting and a braking phase. And I'm saying foot, but this is happening at the pelvis essentially. So I have momentum going down to the right. I am free falling in that position through the time that my heel hits the ground, or if it's a cut and it's a strictly horizontal cut, by the time that your like your lateral foot hits the ground, you have this free falling motion. As soon as I begin to concentrically orient against that free fall, typically going to be around 30 degrees of hip flexion, I have concentric muscle activity. I have amortization. So amortization at this point is going to be, I am fully stopped going to the right, and I am now going to start pushing off to the left again. So that's that transition between going into a cut and going out of a cut. That brief second is going to be max IR on my right leg. So during this, I've got full ER on my left, because it's probably not on the ground at this point anyways. Like when I'm going through a cut, generally when you look at like a skater cut or whatever, like that left foot's up and kind of behind me, that's going to be an ER bias on that left side. And it's going to be a full IR bias at the amortization phase on my right. I'm starting to pronate at the foot. I've got tibial translation that's forward. I've got a sacrum that's nutated. I've got, I've got femoral acetabular IR on the right side, because I'm generally turned in that direction as I'm loading over that way. And then I'm going to have a transition after I get that's still compressive as I push, and then I'm going to start to leave the ground again. So that's where I transition as you loop back through here, back to ER. So I'm now in that propulsive phase. I'm going around, I'm leaving the ground, and we're out to a next step on the cut by the time you make it back through the midway. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you talk about the other leg as this is happening now that we went through the right leg, what the left
Right.
leg's doing?
So what move are we going into?
Let's say we're going into a sprint.
So I've transitioned from a right leg cut, pushing back to my left, and the left foot's going to step out and gate in terms of a sprint. So now, as I leave the ground on that right leg, my left leg, as I'm leaving the ground, is now in this unweighting phase. So I don't have a lot of contact with the ground. It's overarchingly an ER bias because there's nothing to push back down against. There's nothing pushing up on me when I'm off the ground. As soon as that foot hits, my leaving the ground, and probably by the time I hit this next arrow, that begins my free fall unweighting phase on the left leg then. So I've pushed off my right leg. I've gone through this cycle all the way around to leaving the ground. I'm leaving the ground off my right leg. My left foot's hitting the ground, and I'm transitioning from late to middle to, or from early to middle to late propulsive. So what that becomes is this ER, IR, ER bias again. So we loop back through that, and then it becomes a cycle. So there's energy put in as I go into the cut. There's energy released as I go out of the cut. There's energy restored. So energy, again, the unweighting phase is going to be yielding connective tissue. That is energy storage. So when I go back to ER, there's energy storage again, and there's energy output again as I push off for IR. So it becomes very cyclical, and that's why access to these ranges of motion are important, because their efficiency is really, really reliant on one another. So for me to be able to perform at a high level throughout a competitive game requires this cycle to happen again and again and again at like the highest level of efficiency as possible. The efficiency comes from having connective tissue that is able to store and release energy without much input on my end at all. That's the goal, is to have, like, you want, like, muscle activity requires energy expenditure. Connective tissue energy storage and release doesn't require a whole lot of energy release on my end. Does that make sense?
Yes. So now I'm wondering, if we take this a step further, your athletes who are really good at the like IR rate or eccentric rate of force development, but have trouble with the unweighting phase, like what is that going to look like during the course of the game when they're making these moves, cutting, hip turning, all that stuff?
There's a couple ways you can look at that. So depending on some other factors like their shape and what the actual rate of force production is for them, or rate of force development is for them, it could be a very, very slow cut, right? So it takes them a long time to produce force because their runway is so long. That's what, unfortunately, that's what traditional strength training does at heavy loads, is creates a long runway for force production to reach its peak, which is slow. That essentially is a slow athlete. Or they produce so much force but are incapable of accepting the same amount of force with any type of quality and any type of connective tissue lengthening. So they blow through connective tissue. And I'm not saying that happens every time, right? There are more inefficient athletes than there are efficient athletes. Like most people aren't getting trained with a lot of these considerations. And so there are people who frankly are just fortunate and the fact that they haven't sustained an injury from something like that. But the likelihood of something happens increases the narrower these movement option windows get. So you try to have them, the general simple way of looking at it is have them be able to accept the amount of force they can produce, like have them be able to do that well. And generally you've got an athlete that's able to be pretty resilient, and not, that doesn't guarantee they're going to be a fantastic athlete, but it does guarantee they'll be available to play.
So from a training standpoint, you're figuring out what qualities they're lacking in terms of these things, and then are you watching them practice, watching them play games, and then as the season goes on, as you train, looking to see if those are changing for you?
Yeah, and I don't know that you can ever really watch closely enough from a game standpoint to understand if what you're doing is making a change on that. But you rely, that's where you rely on the data stuff. That's where you rely on the fact that we are heavily monitoring an athletic movement that is, it's easy to say vertical jump is a vertical jump is a vertical jump, and it doesn't really apply to anything else. But that counter movement jump is really applicable in my mind to how they stop and start, acceleration, deceleration, how they get into and out of a cut, because the force plates are also, they're left versus right foot reading. So like you can tell side to side kind of an asymmetrical difference in how they generate or how they accept force. So that to me tells me who's going to be a better cutter off their right leg, who's going to jump, who's going to jump higher off their left leg, who's going to be able to land with any type of quality on their left leg. And so that has benefit to me. If you're able to make those correlations, that has benefit to me outside of just vertical jump training. So that's where that stuff becomes important, because then, if I'm getting reliable and I'm getting consistent data that I believe is reflective of what's happening on the court, which we can get into a whole nother thing about that. But if I believe that what I'm getting is reliable, then I don't really necessarily have to watch a ton of what they're doing on the court, and I have to trust that they can't cheat the machine well enough to know what I'm looking for.
So on the force plate, how would you measure how he's getting in and out of the cut? I mean, we just do the cut on the force plate?
No, I will make a for lack of a better phrase, I'll make a leap to be able to say that if they are descending in the counter movement jump the way that I would like to see them descend in a counter movement jump in terms of visually and from the data standpoint, and there's not this huge asymmetry between both sides, that they're going to go into a cut the way that I want them to go into a cut.
Is that off a 1 foot jump or a 2 foot jump or both?
2 foot jump. So we do really? 2 foot. We only do 2 foot jumps, but because the force plates read independently of one another, right, it'll tell me left versus right differences. So then I can say, okay, right foot had, right side had a really, really heavy braking phase that was a longer rate of force development than the left side. Mm-hmm. Right foot's going to have trouble getting out of a cut quickly. That's a really general view, but that's how you can look at that.
Once the season's over, we got to get together.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything on this computer because it's not my work computer, but yeah, I mean, like the unfortunate thing about the force time readout is that it basically finds a best fit line. So it combines both sides to show equality in terms of like what the pelvis is, in my mind, what the pelvis is doing the entire time. Right. But it doesn't take into left versus right biases. And so that's where you have to actually go in and look at what's the left side doing, what's the right side doing in this counter movement jump. And then I have to make some stretches, because really the vector of force doesn't matter a whole lot to me. Like all of these guys live in some phase of propulsion, right? Like they either live, most of them don't live in early. So they're either living in middle or late propulsive stages. So I can assume that anything going forward for them in general is going to be difficult to stop on, because the momentum is taking them forward already. So for them to be able to push back and create space posteriorly that's going to help them stop themselves doesn't happen a lot. So when you look at a guy, make a lunge stop from a jog on the court, heel is almost never hitting the ground. Like they're always so forward, and they're so, shin angle becomes really positive, and force is always, difficult for them to put the brakes on. So I can make that jump with almost everybody on the team just based on the fact that I know what that's going to look like when the vector of force production changes. So if they're going forward or they're going side to side, I can understand that their orientation is already biased towards going forward all the time. So I can, it's just like taking table measurements, right? Like I take table measurements and I say, okay, we're limited in hip or internal rotation. Then I have to say, what's it going to look like when they get up and they stand up on the ground? Because that's where I have to find usefulness in that is when gravity is pushing down on them and there's not a table stopping me from the bottom. I can still make that leap between those two things. It takes some imagination to be able to say they're going to be good at this, they're not going to be good at this based on the fact of where they're getting pushed.
Any patterns you've noticed so far, just anecdotally, in terms of force plates measurements and what you're seeing on the court with certain players?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it's going to be, there's so many variables in general. Left leg is always really good at pushing and not so good at the force acceptance side of things. And right is pretty average at both. And the explanation most people will give you for that is, okay, yeah, they're all right-handed. So whenever they take off the ground in a single leg fashion, which is almost always they're jumping off their left, you're going to run into people who have a left force production bias asymmetry. And that's, for me, across the board been true. And it might just be the group of guys that I have. But then you start to look at some of Bill's model and left anterior orientation of the pelvis, and even guys that are left-handed, so they jump more often off their right foot, or they're 2-foot jumpers, still have a left anterior orientation. So when you start to think about like precession and downward spinning of the guts to the left and having to overcome that to go in a straight line, like it's kind of human nature, and it just happens to make sense in terms of the majority of the league that I work with being right-handed and left foot dominant. It's certainly a pattern that doesn't feed getting out of that pattern well.
So we're talking about the return to play where you want them at a certain level that they were before.
Right.
How does that factor into what you just talked about the vertical jump? I mean, is that something where you just look at, say, the vertical jump and you can tell all these things and, okay, they're back to where they started, or a percentage of where they started, they're okay to play?
Right.
I mean, is that how you look at that?
Yes. From a pure data standpoint, if you were to ask a data scientist within an organization, the athlete, so I might not, as the data scientist, might not ever have to see the athlete actually jump.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as the numbers correlate strongly enough with pre-injury numbers, the athlete is ready to return to play.
And so they're ready to cut and do the other things just based off that vertical jump?
Not in my opinion, but
what do you think about that? In
the opinion of the team, yes. In my opinion, probably not. Because I know I just look at it differently than what I think other staff members are going to look at something like that.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So let's go off Corey's example of someone who has got a left later bias and a right middle bias. So really good at IR, or in IR on the right, in a later stage of ER with really limited movement window on the left. That person is going to be biased towards a right turn regardless, because they're constantly pushing off their left and kind of trailing behind with their right side. So there's a little bit more of a delay on their right. So was your question more of how do I address that through training, or how do I like?
No, I'm trying to look at it and say, okay, here's these numbers. Let's say we want to match up with the previous injury numbers.
Right.
And so, and then, so the numbers are the same, but I want to know how you look at it as, okay, that still may not make them ready to return to play.
So the easy answer for that is hopefully, yeah, it does. So during this entire ramp up period, as we're in a retraining, reconditioning phase of their return to play, hopefully what I've done is taken the numbers that they had prior to injuring themselves, and I have trained them in a way that mitigates some of the issues that I was seeing already. So hopefully part of that return to play, if we're talking about a lower limb injury, hopefully part of that return to play process for me is increasing their movement capacity options, right? Because if that's something that needed to be addressed prior to injury, and the injury is in theory, because I can't prove what's the cause of an injury anyways.
Right.
If part of the injury is they have connective tissue or they have concentric musculature that's too stiff during a portion when they should be unweighting, the thought process on my end is some of our, or a majority of our reconditioning training, because we have time to do something like that, because they're not playing their sport, is going to be heavily biased towards learning how to eccentrically orient the musculature, learning how to externally rotate X, Y, and Z. So if we're looking at, an ilia and a femur or whatever we're looking at, you're going to learn how to externally rotate. You're going to learn how to eccentrically orient, and hopefully your connective tissue is going to learn how to yield.
So you're actually using that time to improve the things upon the things that they couldn't do necessarily very well, even though the numbers are still the same.
Yes.
Okay.
Hopefully
okay.
by the time that we get to a point where because really when they look at return to play and they're looking at force plate data, they're looking at outputs, like is their force production capability the same as it was before? Because now they're not afraid to push off that leg or whatever it is.
Right.
If we've gotten them up to that point, and I've also increased the movement window that I want them to work in, and the numbers are similar, then I'm okay. Because now I trust that they've built a robustness in the ER/IR field that allows me more ER, and they're going to, if the force production side of things is the same, then IR is still being met the way that it should be met.
So are you looking at this in terms of what you're seeing in the weight room and like in their practice, or are you looking at this just with the counter movement jump in terms of what it looks like and what the unweighting and the braking phases look like, not just like the whole thing that like a data scientist may look at?
Both. I think, it would be foolish of me on my end not to look at, how they handle load in the weight room, how they, because it's such a controlled environment for me, right? I have a specific way I want each person to do whatever the exercise is. And so as long as I've set up the constraints of that exercise and they're successful in it, then I can move forward with what I'm looking to move forward with. And then as long as, and again, we're very safe with the way that we reintroduce someone to sport anyways. So it's especially easy to focus on a guy when they're playing small-sided games against practice players, or, only going through one-on-one with a skills coach, because then it's very clearly, and we can, with a skills coach, you can design how an athlete does stuff. So how much defense do they have to play? Like what kind of positions are going to be required of them when they play against a skills coach, because the skills coach is hopefully smart enough to put them in those positions during the workout. And so then, you can look at that stuff and say, okay, like it's quick, but at least on the deceleration this time, when they put their right foot out in front of them, they were able to have heel contact when it started. Their tibia stayed relatively vertical through the deceleration, and they were able to maintain like an upright torso. So the tibial angle and the torso are going to tell me where the sacrum's at. And so now they have access to an unweighting phase. They have access to counter nutation of the sacrum, which means that the pelvic diaphragm is eccentrically oriented. So you can make a lot of connections based on that. And again, athletic movement doesn't happen in this narrow window. So I have to respect that movement has to then loop back around into something that is force production biased. But if those two things interact together well, then generally you have a good outcome on the court.
Well said. I mean, it makes sense too, because if someone has a non-contact injury, or they have the same series of non-contact injuries, and your goal is to just get them back to the same force production numbers on a force plate, you may not be addressing other qualities you can address in the weight room that may be another factor in terms of why they continue to get injured.
Yeah, it's when everything is looked through, and again, this is like we all have our biases and like the lenses that we look through based on experience. If strength, if I came from iFast and I hadn't been exposed to Bill and hadn't had all of like the kind of pre-education that got me ready for this job, I could easily think working with 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids that strength is the problem-solving answer to everything, right? Like that would be easy for me to assume because in that population, it fixes a lot of stuff. Like general strength training fixes a lot when you're working with undeveloped athletes. And if I came to this environment and I said, strength training is what works with undeveloped athletes because they are essentially undeveloped athletes at this level too.
As far as weight room.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would be wildly unsuccessful because it is sport for them because now so many of these guys play year-round basketball. Sport is a level of training. Sport provides load because I'm leaving the ground, I'm hitting the ground, I'm running, I'm jumping, I'm cutting. You know, I have other people that I have to move out of my way depending on what position I play. There is training involved in this. They're not untrained. They're not weight room savvy, but they're not untrained. And so if I was going to treat them as someone who is completely untrained from a physical literacy standpoint, I would run everybody into the ground. It's not useful. It doesn't help me magnify. And like, again, I'm talking about like the top 1% of basketball players in the world, but it doesn't help. Like they are incredibly good at doing the things that are asked of them from a force output standpoint. Mm-hmm. So maximizing their force output and having that be the direction that all of my training is taken is going to reduce all of their other options of being like a decent moving human being.
I like it. Rufus, anything you want to ask?
Where do I start? So let me backtrack a minute here. So if I'm still stuck on this force plate and the data thing.
Mm-hmm.
So if I take the data and we get him back to the previous data, that means he can play at his previous level.
Right.
But we haven't done anything to improve him I get that was my question.
You have, by making that correlation as prior to injury data, right, being the threshold for return to sport, you have essentially said, without changing anything else, you've said what got them hurt from a non-contact injury in the first place is an acceptable place to return them to play.
Right. I got
when they come back. So if you haven't taken that time between injury and return to play to correct the things that you need to correct, you're putting somebody back on the court that has already hurt something based on those numbers.
Right.
So it makes no sense.
Right. Yeah, I got it now. Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. You've said, okay, you got hurt non-contact because of these numbers, because you were capable of achieving these numbers. Let's make sure you get back to that.
But improving those numbers aren't necessarily going to help you either.
Improving the numbers, it depends on which direction I need to go. Improving the numbers in force output could hurt me worse.
Okay, so that's what I was going to say. They're not necessarily going to make you better or more, I forget the word, injury mitigation. Is that how you said that?
That'll do. Yeah.
Right, so we haven't changed that necessarily. We just got him back to where he was, but now we use this time, okay, here's what he can't do.
Right.
Or we need to improve this, not that he can't do it, but we need to improve this more and to lessen the chance of injury.
Yeah, you need to, like, if they were hurt, we need to have like the self-awareness to say, if there was an issue in these numbers, let's say the numbers were the end all be all, like the gold standard of what we were looking at. Because if I'm a coach who's unable to look at movement and make a judgment call from that, I have to look at the numbers. And the numbers are going to say, this is what I was capable of from an output standpoint. So from a force production standpoint, and this is what this is how I landed from that force production. Right. And I got hurt at that level. The standard of care for return to play says, get them back to that level.
Right.
And I'm saying that doesn't make any sense. Why would I get them back to a force production and force acceptance level that allowed for a non-contact injury to happen when I need to probably raise the ceiling for force acceptance and be able to maintain the force output end of things?
I got you. Okay.
You got to make them more robust. Like you have to allow them to be able to again, it sounds simplistic, but they've got to be able to land from the heights that you're allowing them to jump through.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I got you. So the typical rehab that high school kids get is, and they tell you go back to play, is useless, pretty much.
It's again, they're decent baselines. They are, and a lot of high school, I don't know that high school teams do a lot of like force plate stuff. I think more often than not, they have a very like standard protocol. There's phases of return to play that they go through.
Not at the high school, it's at the rehab place.
Right. And so that stuff is it just doesn't tell a whole picture, and it doesn't think about like the long-term effects that just getting them back to a baseline can have on an athlete. Like,
right.
If they had issues at that level before, it only makes sense to try to improve on those things while you have time.
Yeah. I got you. Okay. Carry on, gentlemen.
Well, I got one final question. If there's anything you want to ask before, Rufus.
No, I mean, how soon's your season over is what I want to know.
Well, we're so good. It should be done next month. So.
Oh, okay, good. Now we got to wait a month to come talk to you.
Right.
We'll have to go get something to eat and bring all your stuff.
We got to do stuff. Yeah.
For some reason, I don't know why, the data fascinates me.
Yeah, it's so I've loved that.
And I know that you can't rely just on the data, but it's still really interesting to me.
Yeah. I do love like I said at the beginning, being able to like connect the dots between things. Like I've always been and this really does stem from like being around Bill and Ty at IFAS. Like I've always been so visual with the way that I've looked for like qualities of things, right? Like so again, I have 20 minutes with guys now. I don't have an hour like I had at IFAS. So it was really easy in that hour at IFAS to be able to like cover a huge array of movements and like really dial in each one to be what I want it to look like. I don't have the luxury of that now. So I have to be able to pull things from the data, from like what our physical therapist is saying they had an issue with and they had to mob that day. Like I have to be able to make correlations of things that I pulled from and didn't visually see other than just what they're doing in the weight room and what they're doing on the court. Because I don't have access to a whole lot of time with them. Right. So any type of information that I can get about the athlete from another source that I think is at least consistent in its reliability is going to be beneficial.
Right.
And so that's where being able to say, if I'm not good at unweighting, I probably don't have a lot of ER is important to me.
Okay. So how much percentage, and I know you don't have an exact number probably, but what do you think the percentage is of non-contact to contact injuries?
Oh, sheesh. In the NBA specifically?
Yeah.
So what becomes interesting is contact is typically described as any type of contact with another human being, right. Or an object, I guess, if they're running into the stands or anything like that. So let's say that I'm coming down from a rebound and I get shoved by another person and I now land awkwardly.
Mhm.
That's a contact injury, but the injury didn't result from anything abnormal in terms of like
Right.
anything other than my impact with the court, but another human being caused me to impact the court wrong. That's
Yeah.
technically a contact injury when it's listed like that. So I don't know. I would say based on that definition, there are probably more contact injury than non-contact injuries because every
Oh,
time a guy lands on somebody else's foot and twists their ankle, contact.
yeah.
Anytime they dive on the floor after a loose ball and they, jam a wrist back, contact. So I don't think, and I think this is the difference between basketball and football. Football, I think, has a good number of non-contact injuries because it's really clear when contact happens in football. And
Mhm.
so many of the times it's at a higher velocity. Like the basketball court is too short for guys to have like this big, high end velocity sprint and for them to put a foot in the ground and cut and have
Mhm.
that something like that blow out or,
Yeah.
jump so high from a landing or jump so high and then land awkwardly without having somebody's foot underneath it. It doesn't happen a whole lot. But football, you have like higher end speeds for longer duration. Guys put a foot in the ground. You have a surface that's not as giving as the basketball court is, and they're putting their foot in the ground and then, essentially not able to stop their momentum over in that direction as something happens. So,
So I did. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think
Yeah.
field size and their speed matters a lot.
So I just looked. Derek Hansen just put up a chart with ACL injuries.
Mm-hmm.
He put up by team and stuff, and so one of the questions was, how many of them were contact, and it was like 70 to 75% was non-contact injuries. That's why I was asking, and I forgot about there's probably a difference in contact.
Yeah, what they consider contact in the NBA is not what they would consider contact in the NFL.
Yeah.
And so that's where it's so hard to define the two things. And then just the constraints of, like I said, the playing field, the density of the playing field. Like basketball has 10 people total on the court. Football's got 22 on a field, and they can get much higher speeds than we can. So.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Go ahead, Corey.
Final question.
Yeah, I'm my head's spinning right now. I don't even know.
I was gonna say I don't know how much more I can wrap my head around today. This is awesome. But I just want to hear how you feel like your experience just coaching for a couple of years at IFAST and your other internships prepped you for where you're at now.
Yeah. So the biggest gift I think IFAST gave me was like through a creative lens and specifically with like creative problem solving. So I think that when you like, and for people who haven't like experienced like what the private sector is, like IFAST is even unique. I struggle to even call that private sector because it's so different than any other private gym. But essentially you have a PT clinic and a gym / sports performance studio that like is really well-rounded and all encompassing in terms of a staff development. So while all of us might have done some stuff differently or had different viewpoints on things based on the clients that we worked with, everybody was generally on the same page and able to speak the same language. So IFAST gave me the opportunity to work with athlete rehab, but I also had gen pop rehab and pain management. I had youth athletes, I had college athletes, I had professional athletes. So from a problem solving standpoint, I could have similar problems with different groups of people, and the strategy to deal with that problem became different based on who I worked with. Like a poor example of this is just like athletes are really, really intrinsically motivated and also intrinsically receptive to like sensation. So like a lot of athletes, you could tell them, do you feel this on your body when you're doing this exercise? And they would say yes or no based on if they felt it, but they feel things a lot differently. And when you have people who are a little bit less exercise inclined, I guess, or less trained, those people generally don't feel things when you ask them that. So you can't ask those questions in order to kind of determine the success of an exercise or not. And so, your cueing becomes different, your question asking becomes different, your setups become different. And even though you could be trying to achieve the same goals in terms of an end result with an exercise across the board, the way that you coach that and the way that you set it up and the way that you coach the breathing and, the implement that you put in their hand, even, the difference between doing a rope chop and a bar chop and stuff like that becomes important when you're working with different populations for a specific outcome. And so your decision-making really becomes refined. And I think that, that's true of any time that you're training different people. But I think that, how quickly that refinement came for me was definitely like a big part of being at iFast and having, you guys have been there, not the most equipment or like the most options of equipment to use, but being able to use them in a way that I think affected change more quickly with people in less time. So obviously time is a big component of what I'm, having to fight against here, because it's really, really limited. And it's not like, it's not everybody's, nobody's end goal is to be in the weight room with me. It's to be on the court. So I have to be really, really efficient in the way that I use that time, but I also have really, really specific problems that I'm trying to solve at the same time. So I really learned how to cut the fat. I learned how to make the best use of my time. I learned what was going to be, like, based on how receptive they are to an exercise, like what's going to be effective in the time that I have given. What am I going to spend time coaching, and what am I going to spend more time observing or less time saying, giving any feedback to? So yeah, I had never had experience in professional sports before this job. So I think that I still have a lot of learning to do in terms of like the environmental aspects of basketball. But it's been great, honestly. Like I think that, the experiences that I had, coaching at iFast was much more difficult than coaching in professional basketball is. And that's weird to say, because this is supposed to be, the highest level of what I do. But there were many, many more challenges and much more like day-to-day obstacles in the private sector and than what I'm doing right now.
Well said.
That's awesome.
Appreciate
Well,
that.
this has been awesome. God dang.
Good.
Like I said, my head's spinning.
I only had to ask Corey 5 times to come back on, so finally.
Hey, you're our second guest. We just started up last week, so
you got to contact the boss, right? My name's
I'll tell you what.
My name's on. You come back on anytime. You do what?
I got to go straight to the top next time. I can't keep getting in Corey's DMs every 5 minutes.
Don't deal with the second teamers.
I know. So I try to tell people that. Yeah.
You want to come to the high guy? That's me.
Sure.
Because my name's on it. So.
Your name's on the podcast.
Your name.
That's right. I'm the high coach. Yeah. Got that out of cowboy movie. So no, that's been great. So again, tell us where we can find all this information. I know you're posting almost daily, aren't you? Pretty much. On
it's slowed down quite a bit. I was at one point, and I think I'm going to try to get, my time's going to be a little bit more relaxed going forward. So I'm going to try to get more stuff out. But I basically put stuff up so that people can ask questions or like poke holes in what I talk about, because I need an outsider's perspective a lot of times. So that's why this conversation is so fun, because you guys ask questions that I typically wouldn't have thought of on my own based on what I'm seeing. So I'm really active on Instagram, so eph.24, and so you can see the posts that we talked about today or whatever else I'm putting out these days. Also, I guess, you can, if you have questions about what I do, like hit my DMs on there, comment on a post, or I'll give out my personal email. So Erik, ErikHudd@gmail.com if you guys have any questions about anything.
Okay.
Shameless plug.
That's all right. Plug all you want, man. Anytime you want to come on, just who to call now.
I gotta call Rufus. Yeah, I can't keep going
right.
for it anymore.
That's right. Don't mess with the second team.
Yeah.
You're gonna go to the guy who doesn't even know how to use Instagram.
Hey.
Yeah. That's exactly.
He sent me the schedule for this, so that's all that matters.
Not only do I not know how to post on Instagram. No, I told you I did one the other day. I posted something.
Yeah.
And
you did?
but yeah, not only do you go to that guy, but and Corey's the one that's teaching me all this stuff, so I can understand what the heck you're saying. We have to get on early so I can follow his question. He says, I'm gonna ask him about this. I said, all right, tell me about it. He goes, I got no idea.
Oh my God.
But no,
well, hopefully
Corey's not second team to anybody.
Yeah.
You
Now,
can
hopefully